Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our work session of Las Cruces City Council. Today is Monday, January 10th, 2022. It's approximately 1 p.m. Before we begin, if you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to have our pet of the week, and Jennifer Martinez, who we haven't seen since last year, is going to give our introduction.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I am Jennifer Martinez with the City's Communications Office. And today I would like to introduce you to our pets of the week. And I am going to start with our cat, whose name is Silver. Let's see here. There we go. Okay. Silver is just under a year old. He does come from a family of 5 brothers and sisters. He is a little more independent and likes to be alone sometimes, but he does love getting pet and getting attention. And then we have our dog of the week, and this is Ulak. This 2-year-old guy is a little shy at first, but he likes to play when he's warmed up a little bit. He loves to go on walks and explore, so if you do have a yard for him to play and run around in, you want to make sure that it is secured, that he doesn't get bored, because he is up for an adventure at any time, and he could be tempted to explore past his designated boundaries. If you're looking for a forever pet and have room to grow with love and attention, look no further than Silver or Ulak. You can call the ASCMV at 382-0018 to make an appointment to visit with either of these 2 guys. And if you have time this weekend, you can visit the ASCMV. They are having a pet parade on Saturday from 9 a.m. to 11:30. And also, if you have room to grow in your home to foster, please consider big dogs. The ASCMV has a welcome package for big dog fosters. And of course, fostering helps to free up space in the shelter, and you can also help teach dogs how to live in a home. You can find more details on the ASCMV Facebook page. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Okay, next is going to be our jobs of the week, and I see Dr. Payadas coming forward.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor and members of the City Council.
Good afternoon.
For today's jobs of the week, we're going to be having an administrative assistant position available at the City of Las Cruces, and this position is going to be closing on the 12th of January of this year. We will also be having a warehouse worker, and this is with Munger Water Services Incorporated, and this position will be closing on the 27th of January of this year. As well as that, we have a physical therapist assistant. This is with Ernest Healthcare, and this position will be closing on March 28th of this same year. We also have a business services consultant. This is available with Ecus Workforce Solutions, and this position will be closing on the 28th of January of this year. And we also have a position available with food service worker. This is with Chief Commissary Network, LLC, and this will be closing on April the 3rd of this same year. Additionally, for a full list of jobs, internships, and volunteer opportunities, remember that the webpage is employeenm.com. And for the City of Las Cruces positions is at governmentjobs.com/careers/Las Cruces. An additional announcement that we have for today is that tomorrow there's going to be a rapid hire event for the state of New Mexico at the New Mexico Workforce Connections office in 226 South Alameda Boulevard. They're encouraging the community to go between 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. And there's going to be positions for family assistance analyst, child support legal assistance number 1, and child support legal assistance number 2. They're encouraging to bring copies of their updated resumes as well as proof of work in the United States. And again, the New Mexico Workforce Connections office is located at 226 South Alameda Boulevard, and their phone number is 575-524-6250. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Dr. Payadas. Okay, next is going to be the COVID-19 update by Assistant City Manager Eric Enriquez.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Eric Enriquez, Assistant City Manager, to give a COVID-19 update. Here in Doña County, we still see the cases, the positive cases continue to climb with the variants that are amongst us in the country, in the state, and in our county. Those cases still are rising. We are seeing some progress. It's slowly, but the vaccinations are still in progress and still continuing to grow as we've gotten up into the 92% with one dose. So moving into that 90s and still in the 80s, and then also with the boosters continues to grow where we're at 33% of the adult vaccinations. I'll give some more updates on some of the things that are going on also in our community. The hospital data, due to the increase in cases, are seeing more cases of positive in our community and new hospital admissions. But the good thing, what we're seeing is a reduction or going down somewhat is those beds that are for COVID-19 patients and also ICU. It's dropped down 0.7%, but it is a decrease from what we've seen last month. So vaccinations still remain the best way to avoid serious illness and death. 83.6% of hospitalizations in New Mexico are those that are unvaccinated, and 88.1% of deaths are among those that are unvaccinated. Again, we cannot stress enough to get people vaccinated in our community. PMG, private company, continues to vaccinate on Mondays and Tuesdays at the farm and ranch, and they're at the county government complex on Wednesdays. They'll also be back in full operation at the public schools as school begins, and they will be also running the test to stay in school as well. Female vaccination bus will be in Santa Teresa, in Anthony, and then coming back to the East Mesa and at Young Park the following week. January 17th is a mask up event that we'll be holding here at Franger Park. There's 1,500 masks that will be available to distribute. Sleeve Up campaign in English and Spanish to encourage those to get vaccinated, as we saw the data that the vaccine really helps to prevent the serious illness and death. This event is a joint venture with NMSU office and the Experimental Learning Community Engagement and Outreach Program. That's a big kudos to our Quality of Life volunteer program coordinator, Scott Rogers, who is heading this up. Also, we're looking at trying to implement a test site there and also vaccines as well on that day. It's from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., but we're looking to expand those hours for the vaccinations and testing. That's all I have at this time. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Eric. No questions? Okay. All right. So next, we have two items on the agenda. The first one is the OIR group, which is the police auditor that was recently hired to look into the things that which we started several years ago. And I believe it's done every 6 months. And so this will be the first time. And I think Viola Perea will be starting this off. And I believe the consultants are in as well.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, councilors. Viola Perea, City Auditor. Today we have the OIR group, which is our police auditor, here today to do their first semi-annual presentation for council. And we have both Mr. Michael Giannaco and Ms. Teresa Magula here to do the presentation.
I know Viola just mentioned your names, but if you don't mind stating your names again when you start speaking, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, City Council, Mr. City Manager. My name is Michael Giannaco, and I am part of OIR Group, one of the principals. As Ms. Perea said, Teresa Magula is with me, and she's a member of our
Mayor, I'm
team.
sorry, excuse me. Can you have him talk a little closer to or raise the mic a little? There's a button there that you can raise the closer to your
Is that better?
better.
Is
Thank
that
you.
better? Great. I have to apologize. It's the first time I've been in person in a long time. Been doing Zoom calls forever, and this is a new experience, or getting used to an older experience. Aha. Thank you. But I want to be heard, so I think, is that better? I think so. Anyway, it's our privilege to be with you this afternoon. We are Los Angeles-based, but since March, we have been working as the independent police auditor for the city. We had a chance to meet with some of you in May of last year when we were first getting started, but I see some new faces that we look forward to engaging with this afternoon. What we're here to do this afternoon is to present the findings of our first report as the independent police auditor for you all. And we just have some very high-level observations that we wanted to make based on our first experience with the police department. And we'll present those and then obviously be available should there be any questions with regard to anything in our report.
Mr. Giannaco, let me just state a couple things. One, we did have an election, and Councilor Vasquez chose not to run again, and Councilor Graham over here to my left, my right, is replacing him, as well as Councilor Sorg chose not to run either, ran for a different office, and that's Councilor Coran over here to my right as well. Councilor Beta-Stuvie happens to be out of town, and Councilor Flores is out of the country. So it looks like, so the only one that looks familiar of those three is Councilor Bencomo. And then she happens to be wearing glasses today, which she normally doesn't wear. So, yeah, there you go. So that.
Mr. Mayor, I really appreciate the lineup.
Yeah, because you're wondering, what the heck?
Yeah, what's going on here?
What's going on here?
But I appreciate the lineup that you presented. And
Sure.
It was great to meet you for the first time. In any event, we have been doing this work for over 17 years as independent police auditors. We are the independent police auditor for a number of jurisdictions. It's a growing trend, particularly in California, which is where we're based, to have an independent set of eyes and ears to evaluate, assess, and comment on police practices. Particularly since the George Floyd murder, it's increased in interest, particularly in our home state. So we are the independent police auditor for about 8 different agencies, mostly based in California. This is the only assignment we have in the great state of New Mexico, but we have found it to be a very worthwhile experience in the 6 months that we've been able to do this work. So as I said, we started in March of last year, and this report that we are presenting today is the accumulation of 6 months of work. And our scope of work will be that twice a year we will be making similar presentations to this body on what we are presented with, what we think of the way in which the police department holds its people accountable, the strength of its investigations, and whether or not the outcomes make sense based on evidence, which is what we like to see. It's really obviously a critical point, responsibility of policing to ensure that when there's an allegation of misconduct or impropriety, that there is a thorough investigation, a fair investigation, and then a principled outcome. And that's all we can ask for. And this is the 6-month review is an accumulation of our observations with regard to those metrics. Our first 3 months, we got to learn the department. We became familiar with the policies and procedures, protocols, and expectations of the police department. We started to evaluate and review the policy manual, which is extensive. These days, policing is a complex business with a lot of expectations. Then on May 1, we started receiving actual investigations. To be completely understanding of this when I say we received investigations. We received the investigations, and by that I mean not only do we receive the investigative reports, but we receive any of the underlying materials that accompany those reports. So it's full, unfettered access to confidential information that we have been receiving for these past 6 months. And in our view, without the ability to access the underlying material, we wouldn't be able to fairly do our job in evaluating the work of the police department. This is really, though, just to try to be specific, this is really more about evaluating how the command staff and leadership of the police department is doing. We're not so much focused on the actual misconduct of the officers or the employees. That's important. But what we're really trying to do is, when there is an allegation of misconduct, how well is your police department investigating those allegations? How fairly are they investigating the allegations? And how completely and are they investigating the allegations? Timeliness is important. That's another metric we look at. And then with regard to the outcome, whether the outcome is based on the information or, like in some jurisdictions, unfortunately, what we see is that whether a case is sustained against an officer or not will sometimes depend on whether or not the chief or leadership like the officer or don't like the officer, and that's not what you want to see. You want to see an evidence-based result. I think I will now turn it over to my colleague for the next set of slides.
Okay, thank you very much.
Be moving that down. Is that okay to hear me? All right. Thanks, Mike, for that introduction. My name is Teresa Magula, and I am also part of OIR Group. I'm going to get you into the weeds of our audit now. And our scope of audit, as Mike said, for this particular period were those cases that were received starting on May 1. But the cases themselves were initiated, investigated, and closed by the police department from January 1st to November 30th. So we're looking from the start of the year until about a few months ago. And as Mike said, we are determining whether those cases were complete, objective, and thorough, and that the actions taken were appropriate. So outcomes such as the discipline that an officer may or may not have received. And then, of course, as I'm going to do today, I'm going to report on those key demographics that we may have found during the course of our review. Okay, so in this period, we had a total of 12 IA cases, IA internal affairs cases, and that included 5 formal citizen complaints. A citizen complaint would be when a member of the public files a complaint with the Las Cruces Police Department of alleged misconduct of department personnel using the public complaint process. We also saw 2 internal investigation cases. Those are cases where the department becomes aware of misconduct and will initiate a case internally. So that doesn't come from an external source member of the public typically. It's coming from inside the department. They become aware of it. We saw 2 supervisor matters, and those are complaints of misconduct that are investigated at the supervisor level. So rather than being investigated by the internal affairs unit, they are investigated by that officer's chain of command supervisor. We saw 2 vehicle pursuit cases, and 1 case that actually came in from the Las Cruces Ethics Hotline, complaint hotline, and that case involved some Las Cruces police officers, and so it was directed to the department for their internal review. We also saw litigation that was closed between May and November, so those were 6 cases that were closed in that time frame. Some of those cases date back to 2017, and so they have just recently been closed. And what we saw is that overall, the department is responding with appropriate practices and outcomes. So we saw that the investigations generally were complete, objective, and thorough in the best practices that we have seen in our work. The actions taken were very appropriate and show a real commitment to accountability. and wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't find some room for improvement. And so we did find some room for improvement in IA practices, and Mike is going to speak to those in more detail after I proceed with the demographics. So what we saw in this particular period, and this is very common, is that the incidents are initiated mostly from calls for service. So of the 12 cases that we saw, 9 of those came from a direct call for service. 1 was a result of a traffic accident, so it was the conduct of an officer who responded to that traffic accident. 1 was a traffic stop, and in fact, it was the officer himself who was stopped for a traffic stop. And that one over on the right is our community outreach that is from the ethics hotline complaint. Okay, some of you might be interested about where these are occurring, given that you are representing specific districts. And so we saw that 6 of those cases that we saw this period are from 88001, 3 of the cases were 88005, and 2 of the cases came from 88012. Okay, so you might be wondering if that's within your own jurisdiction and districts. And we saw 1 case was anonymous, that was the hotline complaint. So that did not have a location. We also noted that if the complainant's race was known, 3 of them were Hispanic, 1 was Black, and 1 was white. 2 of the cases, those internal investigations that I spoke of, won't have a race for the complainant because it's initiated within the department. The hotline complaint, obviously anonymous. I'll give you some officer demographics of who was involved. We had 18 named Las Cruces Police Department employees, and those are across the ranks as you can see here. Officer race, of course, the department keeps records on that. 10 of those are Hispanic, 4 were Black, and 4 are white. And one thing I want to highlight is that as we continue our work over the course of time, we'll start to look a little bit at any trends that we're seeing in demographics. That will be both on the complainant, location, and officer side. So if we're starting to see something that looks like it's a significant trend, any outliers, we'll certainly report to this body about that. Okay, so here's where we get good. It's the outcome and discipline. And before I jump into kind of the final stage, which is the discipline that is involved, I want to give you a little bit of kind of a primer on the complaint process in case that's not something you're immediately familiar with. So a complainant or the department becomes aware of misconduct. A complainant calls it in and reports it, or the department becomes aware. The department will then do what's called a preliminary investigation. And in the course of that investigation, the Internal Affairs Unit will determine if there is potential misconduct in this case. They will frame the allegations of alleged misconduct. In this period, we saw that there were 32 allegations framed. The individual allegations are then investigated, and then they will determine if misconduct actually occurred. As a result of the investigation of misconduct, they can come with about 5 different categories of results. So it is sustained if they determine that the allegation did in fact occur, misconduct occurred. Unfounded if they determine that it actually did not occur. The officer can be exonerated, which means it actually occurred, but it was well within the scope of work, the policies, the law of the police department. Another category is not sustained, which would mean that there is insufficient evidence to prove or disprove if something actually occurred. And so in this period, we saw that 19 of those allegations were sustained, and that happened against 11 of the officers that were named. And for those that were sustained, the discipline ranged from something that's known as a verbal reprimand, which could be a counseling session with a department supervisor, all the way to a 10-day suspension, and in some cases, termination. We outline in our formal report which cases aligned with which discipline outcomes. And so we have those charts within our report themselves, should we want to dig in deeper and see what those looked like. Finally, we saw that the preliminary investigation, what happens at the onset of a complaint being filed, had a no finding category. And Mike will discuss a little bit about where we had some trouble with that and where the department has course corrected. And so here you just see the different allegation dispositions and the percentage of cases that fell into that. All right. Okay, so I'll turn it back to Mike for the recommendations that we had related to both process and operational improvements.
Okay, thank you very much.
Raise that back up.
The report itself is over 100 pages, so we're not going to get into detail of all of the cases or even any of them, but are certainly able to answer any questions that you will. One of our goals in our work as independent police auditor is to provide transparency balanced with the interests of confidentiality. So you won't see any named officers or employees in the report, but you will see a very detailed story about what transpired, what the evidence showed, and how the department came to its conclusion about outcomes. We feel that that is critical in order for you all and for your public and your communities to evaluate how well the department is holding its employees accountable. But what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides and then stop for any questions. I'm a trained attorney, so I can go on all day, and I promise I won't go on all day. These are some of the systemic recommendations we made coming out of our review of the cases. The first one, change complaint intake verbiage, just to be a little more clear on what that's intended to convey, is that the department has a complaint form that has been around for a long time. And so if somebody wishes to complain against a member of the department, they can provide information anyway, any sorts of ways. The hotline is one example. Anonymous complaints are received. They can show up at the police station, or they can fill out a form in which they set out the allegations, which is then referred to a supervisor in the department for an investigation. When we looked at the forms that were in use and being distributed to the community whenever a complainant wanted a form, we saw a couple things in the forms that seemed to be outdated and even inconsistent with current policy. And so one of the recommendations we made to the chief was to revise those forms so that they more carefully correspond to expectations as set out in policy. So just as an example, and this is in our report, just as an example, the form that was being handed out was advising complainants that they might be subject to a polygraph exam, which is like a lie detector test, if in fact the department was concerned about the truthfulness of the complainant. While that practice hasn't been in place for years, for some reason the advisory to that effect on the form still existed. Another example on the form that was outdated information was there was an advisory on the form that said, please be advised, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially, please be advised that if you make a false statement against an officer, you could be subject to penalties for making false statements for officers. Again, that has never been done, but the problem with that kind of statement is it could chill or provide a disincentive to complainants to even complain, recognizing that they could be in trouble if, in fact, the department found that their allegations were not truthful. So we had the discussion with leadership of the department, and my understanding is the leadership of the department accepted this recommendation, has revised their forms accordingly. The second bullet had to do with formal findings, and I think Teresa already alluded to this, but what we like to see is findings for every investigation. And under the system that we initially looked at, some cases the department was not making formal findings about. There were lower level cases, but in our view, we think best practice is that the department ought to be making a finding of one sort, no matter what the level of concern is or what the level of the issues. In our view, all these cases should come to a formal finding. In a couple cases, we saw that the investigation was taking longer than best practices. And so in those cases, we recommended that the department do all it could in order to make sure that these investigations were completed in a timely fashion. Timeliness is important for a whole lot of reasons. One is that obviously the complainant is interested in ensuring that the allegation be swiftly and timely considered and completed. It also is important for the officer who's named or the involved officer to have a timely resolution, because in addition to the potential impact that a current ongoing investigation against an officer might have on the career path or promotional opportunities or assignment opportunities for that officer while they're under investigation, the mere emotional toll that it would take to have an officer under investigation for weeks, if not months, without an outcome can have significant implications for that officer and the health of the organization as well. So we like to see investigations completed in a timely fashion. Sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes a witness or an employee may not be available, and sometimes there will be necessary delays in those outcomes. But in our view, that should be the exception and not the norm to get these investigations timely completed. And then finally, the supervisory matter. While we do find that there are times in which there are allegations that are relatively minor in comparison to some of the larger allegations, where a supervisory matter kind of investigation could be appropriate, we saw a couple times where the allegations seemed more serious than a minor allegation of misconduct, and we felt that that kind of allegation should go to a more formal investigation and perhaps even be conducted by the internal affairs lieutenant instead of a sergeant. So every case is case specific, but we did make recommendations about changing that. And by the way, all these four were fairly considered by leadership of the organization of your police department. And my understanding is we're on the same page with regard to these recommendations and the police department. There were a few other recommendations that we had made in this report. One is to ensure training accompanies verbal reprimands. So verbal reprimands is the lowest level of intervention that the department has to remediate its employees. And in our view, because these aren't documented, they're not written, they're verbal reprimands, we wanted to make sure that there was more process and more formality to the nature of those reprimands and consistency about the nature of the reprimands. So what am I saying about what are we saying about ensure training accompanies verbal reprimands? What we're saying is, instead of just simply saying, don't do that again, or we don't like the way you performed that day, we would think that it would be helpful to have an explanation to the employee to ensure that the employee understands why they're being counseled. So a training component, a debriefing component, a more extensive conversation between the employee and the supervisor, we think would be more appropriate to ensure that the employee understands what it is that she or he did that caused them to get crossways with the department. With regard to hotline complaints, this is pretty straightforward, but again, we think that more formality needs to be placed on these complaints, and that they should go and they should essentially be treated like any other investigation that's received by the department. And finally, coming out of the lawsuits or the claims, what we'd like to see is that the way we see it is that a lawsuit or a claim is essentially the same as if an individual gone to the police station and filed a complaint. It's the same thing. It's a complaint about conduct of an employee, but the only addition is there's a potential price tag attached to the complaint, right? Because a claim has a claim for compensation for being harmed by the allegation. The same is true with a lawsuit. So our recommendation here is there be a more formal review of any claim or lawsuit that comes in by the police department for a couple reasons. One is to help provide the city attorney with information about whether or not there is any credence to the claim or lawsuit. But the second reason is to also have an independent assurance that if there is an allegation that's being received by the city, that those allegations are also looked at with regard to whether or not the employee violated policy that gave rise to the claim or lawsuit. We had recommendations with regard to expectations for non-sworn personnel. As you all know, there are a couple departments that are not officers, not sworn officers, but are civilian employees, but they come within the umbrella of the police department. And if you have had a chance to look at our report, there were a couple cases involving one officer who worked for animal control, for example. And when we looked at those investigations, we found that, the appropriate action was taken by the department with regard to these cases, but at least according to this particular employee, one of his arguments was that he didn't realize that the policies of the police department applied to civilian employees. And so our recommendation is to make sure that non-sworn personnel understand that that manual that is primarily written for police officers is not exclusively written for police officers, and that the general precepts, the code of ethics, the code of conduct is all applicable to civilian employees as well. We saw a couple of cases in which there was apparent confusion with regard to domestic standby and welfare checks with regard to what the law is and what the expectations of the police department is with regard to how officers should handle these kinds of cases. And so in order to avoid future confusion, since we saw in a couple cases that we thought the whole department would benefit from training on how to perform consistent with the law and expectations of the department with regard to domestic standbys. And that is a situation that is always potentially dynamic, in which an officer is called when there's a transfer of children by parents who are estranged or divorced, as well as welfare checks, which again, some basic understanding and getting everyone on the same page, in our view, will eliminate future allegations if everyone understands what the process should be. Body-worn camera video is obviously, and you all have, and your department has been outfitted with body-worn cameras for quite a while now, way ahead of many other organizations and many other police agencies in the state and the country. And I think it's worked to the advantage of the department. That certainly is a game changer for us as your auditor, because instead of just having the allegation and then the officer's version of what happened, we almost always will have a recorded version of what has happened that we can then look at and either corroborate the allegation or refute the allegation in the same way that the police department can do the same. The problem is that there are times in which that information doesn't exist because of a delinquency or tardiness in activating the body-worn cameras. And so in those cases, we don't have the information. The department has an expectation, it's clear in policy, that whenever there's going to be officer civilian contact, that by and large those contacts are to be recorded. But we saw a couple cases in which there was either delay or no recording by the officer. Sometimes there were explainable reasons for that. There was no evidence that was intentional, but nonetheless, it's so important, and their expectations are now in your city that there will be a recording of these events. So our recommendation is for the department to make sure that that this becomes a expectation, and that when officers do not live up to that expectation, that they be held accountable for it. The other thing that we recommended is sort of a technological fix, which is newer iterations of body-worn cameras have an automatic activation feature that many agencies are starting to go to. By automatic activation, what I mean is, for example, there are new body-worn cameras where if one officer in a group of responding officers activates their body-worn camera, all the body-worn cameras in the immediate vicinity will also become activated automatically. That's the kind of technological fix we're talking about. Another example is there are now body-worn cameras that will activate automatically whenever an officer turns on his or her lights and sirens. So once they start code 3 driving, that automatically activates the body-worn camera, which eliminates the human factor and automatically gives us a rendition of what occurred. The final piece has to do with tactical training on contact and cover. Tactics are something we're always looking at in seeing how officers respond to an event. And the concept of contact and cover means to approach a situation that might have risk. I think every traffic stop has some level of risk, but for those that are potentially high risk, that officers be safe in how they approach, use contact, which means getting help, calling for backup if you have time, and also taking a position of cover if you're concerned that the individual you're dealing with might have a weapon or might take action against you. Cover is just simply approaching more carefully. Felony stops, staying behind your car door and ordering the person coming back to you. Those are the kinds of tactical things that will keep officers safe and reduce the likelihood that deadly force or any force ends up being used by the officer. And that is my wrap-up. Again, we had obviously a lot of material in this presentation. It's dense. We hope that the actual case summaries tell a helpful story so you have an idea of what it is that the police department is investigating, what kinds of allegations are coming to the police department's attention with regard to the performance of its officers, and how the department is dealing with it. And I will just end with how I started, which is we've only been at this 6 months. 6 months is a blink of an eye when it comes to the length of time of any police organization. But I have to say we are optimistic about the performance of your police department, at least over this 6-month period, for a couple reasons. One is that there was a willingness, extreme willingness to cooperate, collaborate, consult with us by the head of internal affairs, who is our most frequent contact, Lieutenant Gutierrez, and by the chief himself with regard to structural systemic recommendations. And they were very receptive to our recommendations. We didn't feel any defensiveness, we didn't feel any hostility, and we didn't feel any pushback in any significant way. We had conversations, and I think there's a recognition by your leadership that we are really here just to try to improve the organization. We're not here to play gotcha, we're not here to unnecessarily criticize for criticism's sake, but we're really intended to try and improve the organization. And I think that that messaging has been well received by your leadership of your department and such. The other thing is, I just wanted to end with, and that is how much we appreciated the support of the larger city family in our work. So whether it is the information provided by your city attorney or by the information and helpfulness provided by Viola Perea or your city manager, they've been very much involved and engaged in a very helpful way in our work. And so this is only 6 months. It's only the beginning, but and I'm pleased to say this, that overall we find that the department is doing its important work in accountability. It's not perfect, and as I was telling the chief earlier today, so long as the police department is required to hire from the human race, there are going to be people who abuse that authority that is given to them, or misuse that authority, or don't understand that authority in a way that creates implications for your community. And what the most important thing is, recognizing that these things will occur, is how well the department responds to them. Do they take accountability seriously or not? And so far, we can say that in our view, based on the information, and it's all an information-based determination, based on the information, our assessment is that, at least for this cycle, the department does take accountability seriously and is on the right path to ensuring that your community gets the service and public safety that it's entitled. So I will end here, and certainly Teresa and I are available for any questions you all might have. So appreciate your patience and allowing us to walk through what we found, but are certainly available for any particular questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Giannaco. I have to tell you that we probably started this back in 2011, 2010, in that ballpark. This is one of the best reports I've seen even from your previous predecessors. It's extremely impressive and very, I have some questions later, but I'm going to ask the council. So I'll start from all the way to the right, Councilor Graham, then Councilor Bencomo, and Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you so much. It was an elegant presentation, as the mayor mentioned. My first question, if we could step back a couple of slides to the pie graphic that illustrated the findings or the outcomes.
I want to get back. I think I went in the wrong direction.
That's all right.
Yes. Yes, thanks. Just a quick clarification. Can you explain the difference between unfounded and not sustained?
Yeah. So when we are seeing the not sustained, that means that there was insufficient evidence in the package that was collected to determine whether something happened or did not happen.
Okay.
So it is considered to be not sustained. When we're seeing unfounded, that category are the complaints where the act did not occur in the manner in which the complainant alleged that they occurred.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And in regard to the hotline, when someone calls the hotline, do they speak to a live person? Is it something like you leave a voicemail or a recording? Do you have any insight into how that process unfolds?
Yeah, I have insight insofar as the case that we reviewed. I don't know if it's the general practice, and that might be a question for the city manager. My understanding is that the hotline is a live individual who you speak to. In particular, for this case, it was, and the individual who took the call got as much information as the complainant was willing to provide at that time.
Okay, so would the person who is personing the hotline, manning the hotline, do they have a questionnaire that they're filling out?
I can't speak to that, I'm
Okay.
sorry. Yeah.
Good to know. Thank you.
I think, Ifo, you wanted to answer that? Oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. This is Jennifer Vega, your city attorney. Our hotline is managed by an outside third party called Navex. It is a completely anonymous system. When somebody can either call in or they can submit a complaint online through a link on our city website, there are a series of questions that they are asked, and then the person taking in the information answers the questions, and then the questions are, the complaint itself is sent directly to the Hotline Committee, which includes the city auditor, the assistant city managers, and the city attorney. And we review that to see if it is a personnel matter that will get forward to HR, or if it's a different type of matter, then we will look into it a different way. I don't know if Ms. Perea has anything else to add, but that has been our system for a couple of years now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, thank you. Councilor Bencomo?
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you both so much. I'm going to call you Michael and Teresa. I hope you don't mind, because I keep hearing your last names differently. So Michael and Teresa are similar.
Appreciate that, absolutely.
Thank you for coming all the way down here. I really appreciate the thoroughness of your presentation. I do have a couple questions. Since we're in this slide, actually, I wanted to just ask you a question about the no finding. Was that in relation to your second bulletproof recommendation? Just because you said you were going to circle back, and I wasn't exactly clear where that was.
Right. So at the onset of an investigation, when the department receives that initial allegation, they conduct a preliminary inquiry. When we first started looking at these, if the department, in the course of that preliminary inquiry, determined that no misconduct occurred based on the evidence that they received, they were closing out that case with a category called no finding. So essentially they were saying, this is done, no misconduct has occurred, we're going to close that out. What we recommend is that those cases be closed out formally, right? So that even if you find in the course of this preliminary investigation that no misconduct has occurred, that you still complete and close that loop, and you provide a formal finding related to that.
Okay, thank you for that. And then can you just clarify for me a couple numbers that you threw out? So you had 12 IA cases, but what did you review? Did you review 32 allegations?
Right, so those 12 IA cases, within them contained a total of 32 allegations.
I see. Okay, thank you. I wanted to circle back with you on one of the recommendations around, let me go back, let me find it so that I can, this one, yes. Limit use of supervisory matter for serious matters. I'm assuming that when you meet with Chief, that you lay out specifically where you saw this happen more than once, and perhaps you're not telling us due to confidentiality matters or that type of situation?
Right, so we saw, we received 2 cases during this period that were classified as supervisory matters. And so that's a classification within the case management system that the department is using. In one instance, it was classified as supervisory matter, but it was actually investigated at the internal affairs level. In another, we saw that it was sent to the supervisor for the supervisor's investigation and review. We felt that the matter was too serious to have gone that route. And so if you look in the case memos directly, the 2 that are called SM, supervisory matter, would be the 2 that we're referring to with this particular recommendation.
Okay, that's helpful. And in order to prevent that in the future, what kind, I feel like this, I hear you and this is a good recommendation, but what kind of tangible pieces can be implemented for that to no longer happen?
I think as I mentioned, one of them was reviewed, initially classified as a supervisory matter, and then determined, this is too serious to send off, let's keep this in-house in internal affairs. And so I think the department is already engaging in that preliminary investigation to ensure that these more formal matters don't go to the supervisory matter level. In other cases, it might be a question of perhaps conducting a more in-depth investigation at the IA level before sending that forward. In the cases that we've reviewed, we only received 2 of them.
Okay.
So I would want to speak perhaps in the next session if we see more supervisory matters to see how the department is doing related
Yes.
to those.
Yes, that makes sense. And also, if we can make requests for the next session, if you could, I would love to see.
I take requests. Yeah.
Wonderful. I would also like to see just another update on the body-worn camera and the usage and the training on all of that, if that would be helpful, because I obviously, you said you note trends, but 6 months, that's not going to be enough time for trends. So that would be helpful for me. And then in terms of the 2 technologies that you mentioned, are those technologies that, I don't know if this is a question for perhaps EFO or the chief, or you might know already since you're getting to know them so well, if we have looked into these technologies to improve the usage of body-worn cameras.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hi, Chief.
Police Chief Miguel Dominguez for the record. Mayor, Councilor Bencomo, we have looked into it. We're currently pursuing that technology. Takes a while to find modules and things of that nature that work with the body cameras that we have, so we don't have to go purchase a whole new system. So, but we are looking into it.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. I appreciate your response to that. And then maybe, Chief, if you stay up here, since you're there, I'm curious about your plan to ensure that these recommendations and the findings and the report really trickle down, right, to every single person in the department, and what that looks like. How are you thinking about that?
Mayor, Councilor Bencomo, before, actually at the beginning of the year of 2021, we had a meeting with internal investigations and created a position called a compliance sergeant. As a matter of fact, he's sitting here with us, to make sure that we're going through any finding that the auditor has and makes recommendations. We look at immediately some of the domestic standbys, for example. We took the recommendation, and the training has already been held through Target Solutions. We're also implementing it through our biennium training that happens every other year to make sure that we're consistent with that type of training. But any recommendation that we look for or that is made by the auditor, we act upon it immediately, see if we can implement the training right then and there, or implement it into our training as we go throughout the year. I will say that the compliance sergeant also looks at any trends, things of that nature. If we're seeing a couple of complaints or issues that come up through their investigations that we need to address immediately, well, we do it on our own. Put the training out immediately before it becomes a major issue, especially with critical incidents and things of that nature.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that thorough answer. That's it for you. At least for me. Actually, that might be my last question for now. When will the full report be available to us and the public?
I believe the full report is available now.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. It wasn't included in our material, so I wondered if it was.
Did you want to state when that would be available?
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, councilors, the report has been completed and it has been made available, so we'll make sure you all get a copy after the council meeting today.
Wonderful. And it'll be online somewhere for the public to see as well?
Yes, ma'am, we certainly can do that.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's input on this.
Thank you, Councilor. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Teresa and Michael. I appreciate your presentation and your work on this. Past council approved deliverables very specific to this contract. I would ask for you to remind me what those deliverables are. I didn't see a copy of the contract in the packet that was sent to us, so that would be very helpful to me.
Do you have a copy of the contract, perchance? I imagine that she does because she's very thorough. But to my understanding, this semi-annual report is one of the deliverables, and in the course of the semi-annual report, we are to provide council information about the cases that we reviewed, including the demographic categories that I went through. And then we are also to provide information about the different outcomes and the process improvements as we outlined today. But I will let Ms. Correa.
Did she nail it, Viola?
Mr. Mayor, councilors, thank you. Give me just a moment to flip to the
Sure.
page where the deliverables are listed. And also, while I'm doing this, I wanted to add a little bit to Councilor Bencomo's comment. In the contract, we do have it included where we can ask the OIR group to perform follow-up audits. So if there are any particulars within any of the reports that we would like to just ensure that the corrective actions have been taken and things are working as indicated, we can ask the OIR group to come back and perform a follow-up audit on that particular investigation. So to outline a little bit, the services that we contracted with the OIR group include audit of the complaint process, which will include all formal citizen and internally initiated complaints, any complaints against law enforcement received from the city's anonymous hotline system, and they will, again, as indicated in the presentation, ensure that those are, excuse me, take off my glasses here, are complete, objective, thorough, and fair, and that findings and actions taken in response to the investigations are appropriate. In addition, less formal, the EIC3 complaints, those are the non-serious complaints that may be initiated. Those also can be presented to the OIR group for investigation upon request from council or city management. Additionally, we're asking for audits of police operations, and we're asking that the OIR group review policies, procedures, and training issues that grow from these complaint investigations. Additionally, we ask that they evaluate all tort claim notices and/or noticed civil actions, and we like for them to include demographics on offenders and victims, location of incidents, criminal charges associated with those incidents, and the disposition of those cases, in addition to any policy violations and dispositions and officer demographics. Again, as mentioned, it would include follow-up audits as requested by management, statistical and trend analysis on all of the reports that they're conducting or investigations that they're completing for us, comparative analysis, which would compare all the data up to that point and the demographics to both current and historical trends. And then lastly would be on-site presentations twice a year to do a semi-annual report to council.
Viola, I'm glad that Councilor Bencomo asked a question about the 100-page report. When can we expect that? And in the future, could we have that prior to this council meeting or semi-annual or annual evaluation? It would be helpful to have that. I'd love to read it and base a lot of my questions on what I'm reading. So how are you recommending, once we read it and we have questions, then do we field those questions through EFO to the group, or have direct communication with you? I mean, how are we going to really get to, the specifics of that report in the event we have questions and need clarity?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Mayor, Councilor Candela. We meet with our Oversight Committee next week. So what we'll be able to do is present that report to the Oversight Committee for review and comment. And in time for the next semi-annual review, we'll ensure that the report comes in prior and is reviewed by our Oversight with enough time to come to council in advance to allow you an opportunity to review the report and then frame any questions that you might have for presentation when the OIR group is here in person.
Perfect, thank you, I'd appreciate that. So I guess I had a question about the Oversight Committee. It hasn't gone to them yet.
Not as
yet. And once it does, they'll make recommendations. In what form will those recommendations come back to council for us to, I guess, deliberate and determine if it's the best course of action moving forward?
Mr. Mayor, councilors, the normal process with the Oversight Committee on a general audit report is it's still in draft form after it gets reviewed by the city manager for comment. Those comments go to the Oversight Committee. Then they have the opportunity to review and comment as well. If they do have comments, those comments are included in our general audit reports. So they're actually part of the report that will come to council when completed. For the OIR group, what we'll do, since this report has already been completed by the OIR group, we can attach a supplemental memo if there are any comments from the Oversight Committee and have that accompany the OIR group's report as well. So you'll get both the report and any comments that the Oversight Committee might have.
Appreciate it, Viola. Thank you. In terms of those 12 cases that were reviewed, how many were specific to PD codes and the civil side of things? Are you aware? Or do you know what those are?
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Mayor, Councilor Gondara, all 12 reports, well, I'll take a step back. I believe the majority, and don't quote me on the numbers exactly, I would say at least 9 to 10 were LCPD officers.
Okay.
I believe 2, maybe 3, I know for sure 2, but maybe 3 related to codes enforcement. And I'm sorry, what was your other question?
The civil side.
The civil side. None of those 12 were civil cases. There were 6 additional closed litigation cases that were submitted outside of those 12 PD-related investigations conducted by IA.
Nice segue. I was going to ask you about the 6 litigated cases. So you reviewed those, and what did you find? Are you looking for specific things to the deliverables? I guess I wasn't clear and needed more clarity or more specifics about those litigated cases that were closed.
So according to our, excuse me, Mr. Mayor, Councilor Gondara, according to our contract, what we're asking the OIR group to do is to evaluate tort claim notices or noticed civil actions, and these have to be closed. So that's why, as indicated, some of these cases related to an incident from a couple of years ago. That means the case has finally been concluded within the system. So under that particular section, the evaluation of tort claim notices and/or notice civil actions says the contractor shall review and report on all tort claim notices and/or notice civil actions. The information contained in the report shall include information related to matters that have been litigated or disposed and are no longer pending, and shall include but not be limited to offender and victim demographics, location of incidents, criminal charges associated with the incidents, disposition of the case, policy violations and dispositions, and police officer demographics. So that'll be specific to any litigation that does get sent to the OIR for review.
Thank you, Viola. So of those then, given what you've just told me, the numbers reflect those 6 in terms of the 6 that you gave in terms of, I guess I'm trying to figure out how do those 6 get factored into the 12 in terms of what you're actually identifying are issues like formal citizen complaints, how many are supervisor matters, how many are, right? I guess I'm confused about how that gets factored in, and I don't know if there might be another column that you might want to add that says what you're trying to identify and explain here and understand so that I can understand it.
Mr. Mayor, Councilor Gondara, I do not believe that any of the 6 closed litigation cases tie directly to the 12 cases that the OIR group reviewed. I believe those were all from prior to this 6-month period. So it is believed that, at least from my opinion, that when there is a litigation case, there should be an internal affairs investigation tied to that case. But due to the timing of the 6 litigation cases and the 6-month period of the IA reviews, I believe the 12 IA reviews are newer cases, and those 6 litigation cases were from the past, because it does take some time to go through the process there, up to a couple of years even. So I don't think the 12 and the 6 directly have a correlation this period, but we might see that as time goes by, that the cases that are investigated by internal affairs may possibly turn into a litigation if they do take that route, and that's when we're going to see the tie-in. But as far as the 12 and the 6 for today's report, I do not believe there is a connection.
Okay, thank you for the clarity. I appreciate that. But of those 6, based on the deliverables that we asked, what were their findings of the 6?
Yeah, and I apologize because I was under the understanding that the report had been disseminated to you, so I do apologize that that was not provided to you. Some of what I was speaking to was assuming you had the report before you, so I'm sorry for that. I will pull out my report. And that's right. So as Ms. Perea said, the 6 cases were outside of the 12 internal affairs cases. The litigation matters may or may not have an internal affairs case related to the litigation.
Right.
Okay. So in 2 of the matters, there were no allegations of misconduct. They were a request to expunge records and so forth. So those would not have an outcome in the same way that an internal affairs investigation might have an outcome, right? But I can give you so of the 6 that we saw, 4 of them were settled. 1 was dismissed because the claimant did not provide sufficient information, and that 6th one was that request to expunge and seal records. So something that we did not have any expectation that there would be an internal affairs investigation. We saw that of the 4 that were settled, I believe that 3 of them had a related internal affairs investigation that the department was able to find for us. In those cases, again, apologize that it is in the report and not before you today, but we found that there were findings made that ranged from a 1-day suspension to 4-day suspension across the cases. And so those were appropriately investigated by internal affairs, to the best of our understanding, closed, and discipline was imposed to the officers. As part of our scope of work, because these were not part of that package that was given to us, the 12 in this time frame, we did not look specifically at the investigations themselves. Those were closed some time ago, and going forward, if they happen to coincide, we will certainly be reviewing those as well.
Thank you so much for that. And then how many cases, Violet or Chief, go to IA? And what is the 6 compared to the number of cases that go to IA? And tell me what that process looks like in terms of what decision-making is done to then move to sending these cases to the OIR group.
Good afternoon, Chief Dominguez.
Hi, Chief.
Mayor Pro Tem, you're talking about litigation?
No, I'm sorry, I channel change now. Switch over to just the total number of IA cases that you have currently. Or during this period, during the period that OIR was reviewing these cases. I just want to know 12 cases versus hundreds of cases, and what, right? I don't know. I have no really understanding of what's coming your way.
Mayor Pro Tem, every case that was investigated and closed out since May 1st gets sent to OIR. I have Lieutenant Gutierrez here. He can give you a ballpark figure of how many cases we have, but it's...
Mayor Pro Tem, approximately from May till December, out of the 12 cases that were closed, there were approximately 52 C2 cases, approximately 27 C3 cases, and on Supervisory Matters, there was approximately 10.
Thank you. And how many employees do you have currently at IA, and how many vacancies do you have? And I'm sure that affects how cases are, right, worked on and completed and sent over to OIR.
Correct, ma'am. Mayor Pro Tem. Currently have 2 investigators and myself in the Internal Affairs Department. I still have an opening for a sergeant, and hopefully we get some new investigators soon.
Okay. And I guess what types of cases? So all cases that go to IA, I'm under the impression, once complete, go to the OIR group, correct?
Mayor Pro Tem, if they are a formal investigation, such as an II, an internal investigation, or a C1, external complaint, once they are closed, then they will go to OIR for review.
So these are cases that a formal complaint has been made either internally or externally.
That's correct.
So what if you have cases that you're reviewing and you think, oh, they should? Because I thought all use of force cases go to you, yes?
I do a quality assurance check. The use of force is approved through the officer's chain of command. If there is a question about it, a use of force review will be asked for from the IA department to see if there's any possible misconduct.
So do those cases go to OIR?
If there is a possible finding, any hint of it, then an internal investigation is started, then closed, and then sent to OIR.
Now, will you have cases that are still in the queue that don't meet that certain review, the dates that they gave, I guess January to present?
Mayor Pro Tem, not for the uses of force.
Okay, okay. And I'm concerned about the domestic standby and welfare checks, and what specifically you found that give you pause or concern that needs additional training, and what, so more specificity around that, and then the kind of training, Chief, I'm assuming would need to be coordinated with CYFD, or I guess it gives me pause just because I come from that area, right? I used to work in that area, so I just felt I needed to ask that question. If you could give me more specificity around that.
Mayor Pro Tem, the report that you will get has the details on the domestic standby issues that we were seeing. It was specifically, if I'm remembering correctly, it was a couple of complaints that we received because the complainant stated that the officer let the other person take items that did not belong to them, or there was some question as to whether we should have allowed that, and that's the type of training that we put forward.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I guess I'm concerned about those cases, as you can tell with my line of questioning, I guess, related to cases that go to IA, or maybe it should go to IA, I'm not sure, and should be looked at. You're assuring me, Chief, that you as supervisors and chiefs are looking through these cases, and if there's anything that you need to flag, you are sending them to OIR.
Mayor Pro Tem, absolutely. And I'd also like to key in on the supervisory matter that was brought up. One of the things that at some point it was being handled within the IA department. It was a judgment call on their side whether or not they'd send it to a supervisor to investigate or IA would do it. That the way we do it now is it comes to my desk, we have discussions on it, and if it requires an IA, it's going to get an IA. And most of the time, that's what's happening.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mayor. Those are all my questions.
Okay, thank you. So I have some questions for OIR and then also for the chief, or his team. So I'll start with OIR first because it helps it flow a little bit better. Okay, so in your report, in your presentation, you talk about timely fashion, and so my question is, what are we looking at as far as the amount of time, approximately, that you would like to see these completed by, is what I'm trying to get at. Mr. Janako would say, well, they need to be done in a timely fashion, and that's true. Now, we know that 100% can't all be done within a certain amount of months, but maybe 80%, 90% can be done in a certain amount of time. I'm looking for that amount of time.
Well, it's a very important question, because if an investigation is not timely, it's not going to be consistent with industry standards. It's unlike wine, investigations don't
Let me
get
just stop you
better.
right there when you said industry standards. So when you go and get your car repaired, the mechanic likes to pull out certain things saying, hey, you know what, this is what we did and this is how much I need to charge you for. Even though it took him a lot less, but they charge him more. Is there such a thing? So you do have industry standards as far as what should be done?
Yes, we do. I think that, if I had to quote the industry standard, some cases are more complex, and as I indicated, some cases do take longer because of unforeseen situations like unavailability of witnesses, the officer being out. There are other reasons for the delay. But ordinarily, what we like to see is an investigation without any of those hindrances conducted within at least 90 to 120 days of receipt.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. You also talked about non-sworn personnel. Could you give us some examples as to what some of the complaints were? Just some generalities, please.
Sure. The department has responsibility for programs that are outside of policing but are connected to policing, like zoning issues, animal control issues, and those mostly involve people who are not sworn police officers. They're civilians. And so, as I was, my point that I was making in my earlier remarks, Mr. Mayor, was that when we looked at those cases, a partial defense uttered by the involved employee was, gee, I didn't know that this manual of policy and procedure that applies to officers and sergeants and lieutenants applied to me. Our simple request of the department in that regard was to make sure that all employees understood these policy requirements to the degree that they are applicable to civilians apply to you. So they've not only they have the city requirements that all city employees are responsible for understanding, but they also have this subset of other expectations that are included in the police policy and procedures.
Okay. Also, does it have to be a sworn officer to review police body cameras? Like for example, maybe there may be a policy that once a week someone reviews the different officers' cameras to make sure there's no, that they were using them, what percent of time do they use them, why did they just shut it off automatically at a particular time and such? Does it have to be a sworn officer to do it, or can it be a non-sworn personnel person?
To conduct that audit is your question, Mayor?
No, just to watch, just to be able to say, let's just say someone was, that's not a sworn officer, is reviewing it, and they work for the police department, and then they come up with something and they go to their supervisor, whether it's the lieutenant or the deputy chief or the chief. Can they do that, or does it have to be a sworn officer?
I do not believe that there's a in fact, I know there's no requirement that it be a sworn officer. There are some confidentiality issues, obviously, in that kind of review. So it would have to be a trusted employee, but certainly an unsworn, like evidence technician or somebody of that sort that has the technical know-how to do that kind of review and understands police policies and practices could be a reviewer.
Okay, regarding verbal reprimands. So obviously if this was a small department, maybe just like a handful of officers, kind of like, just 2 or 3, it's probably easy to say, hey, remember I told you not to do that. But he's got 170 or so. And so what have you seen as far as how some departments keep records to be able to, I don't want to defeat the purpose of a verbal versus a written, but if they were to say, I told them not to do this, or explain to them they shouldn't do this, do officers have like a file of some sort that they can just say, hey, I gave a verbal reprimand to Joe over here, and that's
right.
it.
It's an excellent question, because you certainly want to keep track of all of the interventions that you've done, whether it's a formal reprimand, a documented counseling, or a verbal reprimand. All those things need to be cataloged. And the way they do it in the department is they have a standalone database that's called IA Pro, in which they enter that information. So, Mr. Mayor, while the counseling may not show up in a document, a standalone document, the outcome will be entered into what is called Blue Team in the IA Pro system and be retrievable.
Does the city have that software? Do they use that?
The police department does, yes, sir.
Okay, and then the last question for you is regarding, and you kind of touched base on it a little bit, but on the lawsuits, and it doesn't have to be on the ones that you reviewed, but just in general. So there's times where we settle for, on behalf of the city, on various departments, but let's just focus today, right now, on the police department. On various lawsuits that we've settled, have you seen if the city, if the PD took any more action toward the officer because, or they just, as well, we settled it and we're done and that's it?
Yes, and this is an important concept because some jurisdictions we have worked with don't communicate back and forth about civil litigation, and in our view, they should. The best practice is to have that communication. But as my colleague, Ms. Magula, said, some cases didn't lend themselves to any kind of allegation of misconduct, like the expungement request, which essentially, I want my record cleaned, I don't want this arrest to be on my record anymore. But some did, and so, as Teresa indicated, I think 2 or 3 of the 6 did result in discipline. We did not go back and look at those cases because they're outside of our period, but we were informed by the department, and we trust the department's reporting, that they did, in fact, result in some accountability with regard to, I think, at least 3 employees.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so next will be for the chief and or his team. So Chief, on the first one, when they were discussing about the verbiage, about the polygraph test and the false statements to, and you know, when a resident, first I just want to start off by saying I can't tell you how much we appreciate, I think it's fair to say the City Council and City of Las Cruces, we appreciate what you and your team and your department does. It's a thankless job. It's an extremely difficult job. I think you've heard me more than once say I probably could do it for one day, and then even if I did, I'd be watching the clock until I got off the clock. And you have got to be one of the most open-minded, willingness to work with the City Council, and I just wanted to start off by saying that. Because the first one, the verbiage about the polygraph test and the false statements, and I know this was your first year when you started, but when, and Mayor Pro Tem and I, and back then Councilor Vasquez, we sit on the Public Safety Committee, and I know we brought this up, and I got the impression that it was going to change. And like I said, it was your first, you had just been appointed chief, and you had to have been just bombarded with so many things. But can you share with me how that slipped by?
Mr. Mayor, we had taken care of it. The complaints that they saw were old speak prior to that. To your credit, you acknowledged that and wanted it changed, and we did make that change. But the complaints that they received, that they investigated as part of the audit process, still had the old complaints that had that verbiage on there. And we explained it to the auditor, that let him know that you had seen it, wanted to change, and we had already changed it. So when we had that discussion, the change had already been made.
Well, thank you for that answer, Chief. You know, I remember after, what did we tell you, EFO, after your 13th month? Your 1 year's over, and no more, hey, this was my first year type thing. So thank you for that, Chief. I appreciate that. Earlier, you heard me, we talked about the verbal reprimands, and I think it turns out that we do have that software, that mechanism. So do you have something that we can kind of be assured that it's going to be documented better?
Mr. Mayor, we have an early intervention system that has different parameters for different types of IA-related materials. For example, a use of force, 2 uses of force within the same month is going to trigger an alert to where we look at it, get the supervisor, make sure that we're looking, is this an issue that's a problem with the officer, or what actually happened? So we look at the incidents. We actually have meetings with the officers, make sure that there isn't an issue, any issues that are going on ancillary-wise with the officer, to make sure that we're keying in on those things, as well as not going to court. For example, I'll give you an example. We had an officer that had 5 failure to appears, and he had a babysitting issue. That's pretty much what was going on. We're able to assist him because of that early intervention system, and that's just one of the many, many things that we look at through that system.
Very good. And then last, and I know you've done some of this because you've explained to us in closed session when we paid out a claim for an officer that for whatever reason in the last, I think like 2 years had 5 auto accidents, and you just said, you know what, you can't drive. We're just going to have to take you off that. But based on what they were saying about other lawsuits that we've settled, are you doing anything different now? Are you kind of reviewing them as well or was it just, what are you doing, if anything, to those that we settle?
Mr. Mayor, any case that's settled out, we look at the issue that caused the case or the litigation. We had one with seatbelts, for example, and we immediately put training out, put a bulletin out, make sure everybody knew that it was a responsibility to seatbelt all prisoners while in their vehicle, make sure that the supervisors are doing it, make sure that all the seatbelts are working and everything else in all the units. So we do look at it and have a training component with all closed cases.
Okay, and I think you also mentioned that your department does do this, and that is review the body cameras. Are you, and earlier I think you heard me mention if we have to have a sworn officer to do that. Is there any plans to maybe increase some, to be able to monitor it a little bit better? And if so, are you needing some additional support from the city as far as to hire 1 or 2 people? Because I would imagine that body cameras are also part of a IPRA request, and so those tend to be, they want to look at that too. So I would think that there's a lot of demand for that. And so is there anything that you would need from the city in the future to keep up with that as well, as and also conform to some of the ideas that they had suggested?
Mr. Mayor, we do have a review process, so it doesn't have to necessarily be a use of force or an incident of concern. We have our supervisors that they're mandated to check periodically every week. They have to just go in and just review several videos depending on the week. But they do have, every supervisor has to just pull up a video, just review it, just to make sure that our officers are using policy and procedure and being respectful, things of that nature. And they're doing their job correctly. But we also have some IPRA clerks that also, before they send out any videos and they see anything in there, they'll bring it to our attention, they'll bring it to Lieutenant Gutierrez's attention and or mine so we can look into it a little bit further. So yes, we do have some civilian staff that are trusted staff that do review. To answer your question on the ask, yes sir, we're asking hopefully during the budget process for 2 to 3 FTEs just to handle the IPRAs, which are growing and growing as we speak.
Great. Well, Chief, that's all I have. I appreciate your responses, and also, again, thank you, OIR, for what you all do. And Councilor Bencomo, looks like
Thank you,
something.
Mayor. Something one more thing for OIR that came up, and thank you, Chief, for your answers to Mayor's question. I just had one question in regards to the zip code data that you provided. It's obviously not enough numbers to sort of tell any story, but in your scope in the future, are you going to be able to give us a deeper analysis of what those numbers mean?
So as we go forward, we'll continue to collect data, like the incident location, and if we see that there's any particular trend, so one area that's markedly higher, for example, we may want to look deeper into why that's occurring and have conversations with the department about that.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Mayor.
Just an FYI, so when Las Cruces was a really small city, it was just 88001. Then we started running out of zip codes, added 5. And then they put 11 for the east side and 12 for the East Mesa. And then, of course, 3 is for the university. So just a FYI. Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much for that. If there's no other questions from the city council, I'm sorry I won't be taking any questions from the public. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Mayor.
I'm sorry. Yes.
May I address the litigation issue? Thank you. When we drafted this RFP, we relied heavily on on notification by the New Mexico Tort Claims Act, which requires a 90-day notice requirement if a lawsuit's going to be filed. The statute of limitation is still 2 years, but we receive notice of a potential lawsuit within 90 days. What happens when we receive that notice requirement is that we do an immediate request to preserve all evidence. We send out a citywide notice. If you've received any evidence, please preserve it so that we don't get a spoliation claim later on. The problem becomes, and we might need to rethink how we're reporting this, with the New Mexico Civil Rights Act, there is no notice requirement. So we don't know if a lawsuit's going to be filed, and the statute of limitations is 3 years. So it may be some time before we even know an incident occurred. We may have already, because of our retention, we may have a problem with locating some evidence. It may be mistakenly or not intentionally destroyed or lost. So that is going to be a bigger problem. So we may need to kind of rethink how we're reporting these incidents to City Council because of the time delay, it could be problematic. So I just wanted to let you know that we are thinking about that, and we certainly need to think of how we're going to report to you, at least so that we know in the shortest period of time if there's a potential problem.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, I was just thinking about the claims that we settled, so they're pretty much done. But was there anything else, Teresa? Was that your? I get your name right?
Not. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council, for your time.
Thank you, and have a safe flight back home. Okay, so next item is going to be the elected officials training by our City Attorney Jennifer Vega and Christine Rivera.
Okay, good afternoon, City Council. My name is Jennifer Vega. I'm your City Attorney. We are providing what is an annual training for elected officials. We do a training for all boards and commissions as requested, and we certainly try to present an updated training to City Council. There's going to be a lot of information covering many topics. Most of you are quite familiar with these topics. So if I move too fast, please feel free to slow me down and ask any questions that you need, and we'll just get started. There's going to be in 2 parts. As we were just kind of briefly discussing, we have an IPRA law. So we're going to have our records manager present to you kind of completely separate on IPRA because it's such a big and important statute that we deal with. The city derives its home rule authority from Article 10 of the New Mexico Constitution, which states that a municipality which adopts a charter may exercise all legislative powers and perform all functions not expressly denied by general law or charter. The purpose of this section is to provide for maximum local self-government. The laws governing municipalities can be found in NMSA Chapter 3, and NMSA 3-15-1 is the Municipal Charter Act. And as you all know, we are a home rule municipality. I'll only read one of these. The municipal corporation shall remain and continue to be a body corporate and public and may exercise all legislative powers and perform all functions not expressly denied by general law or by this charter. That's included in the Las Cruces City Charter. And again, it just mirrors the state statute, which provides for maximum local self-government. We are a home rule municipality, and Section 1-4 of our ordinances exercises that right. The most common laws and issues affecting our elected and appointed officials are the New Mexico Open Meetings Act, the Anti-Donation Clause of the New Mexico Constitution, and ethical considerations such as conflicts of interest and ex-parte communications. We're also going to briefly cover the ethics ordinance and also the accountability and government ordinance. We'll begin with the OMA. It is also known as the Sunshine Law. It is found in Chapter 10 of the New Mexico statutes. This is a quote from the Attorney General Compliance Guide. The Sunshine Laws require that public business be conducted in full public view, that actions of public bodies be taken openly, and that deliberations of public bodies be open to the public. What does the OMA require? It requires that all meetings of a quorum of members of any board, commission, administrative, adjudicatory body, or other policymaking body are declared to be public meetings open to the public unless the law specifically allows an exception. So open meetings are required when we are formulating public policy, developing personnel rules, regulations, or ordinances, any discussion of public business, and taking any action within the authority of any board. Boards, committees, and other bodies that are delegated to formulate public policy and make recommendations to the City Council must also comply with the Open Meetings Act. The OMA prohibits members of the public body from conferring privately during meetings by passing notes, sending emails and texts, or any other means. Members of the public are generally permitted to record or videotape any proceedings. And one important thing that the OMA does not require, which we often get complaints about, but I want to make it very clear, the OMA does not require the public body to allow members of the public to speak at its meetings. That is something that is entirely up to the chair. Meeting notices for open meetings shall include an agenda with a list of specific items of business to be discussed or information on how the public can obtain an agenda. And except in emergencies, it has to be posted within 72 hours of the meeting. And only items on the posted agenda are permitted to be discussed at the public meeting. It is necessary that we keep meeting minutes, and at a minimum, the statute requires that we take the date, time, and place of the meeting, names of members in attendance and those absent, the substance of the proposals that were considered, a record of any decisions and votes taken that show how each member voted. Minutes are subject to public inspection, and the draft minutes must be prepared within 10 working days after the meeting and shall be approved, amended, or disapproved at the next meeting where the quorum is present. One issue that we are constantly trying to monitor and make sure that we comply with is the rolling quorum. The OMA's requirement for open public meetings applies to any discussion of public business among a quorum of public bodies members. A quorum may exist even when the members are not physically present together at the same time and place. The Attorney General gives the following example in the Compliance Guide. If 3 members of a 5-member board discuss business in a series of phone calls or email conversations, the discussion is a meeting of a quorum. Rolling quorums are a violation because they are not properly noticed public meetings. As you will see, when you receive email messages that provide information to everybody, we will always usually try to remind you, please do not respond all. If you do, you have created a potential rolling quorum. So we usually ask that if we send you a large email with information, just respond individually to the person who sent it. This is a very important quote from a case that went to the New Mexico Supreme Court. Public business is the public's business. The people have the right to know. Freedom of information about public records and proceedings is their just heritage. Citizens must have the legal right to investigate the conduct of their affairs. In another case, the court recognized that the Arizona Supreme Court, examining a statute quite similar in language to our section 1015-1, stated that the intent of the legislature was to open the conduct of the business of government to the scrutiny of the public and to ban decision-making in secret. A meeting held in the spirit of this enunciated policy is a valid meeting. We'll move on to the anti-donation clause. This is something that probably comes up, if not daily, almost weekly in city government. The New Mexico Constitution strictly prohibits donations to individuals by governmental entities. The provision provides in pertinent part, neither the state nor county, school district, or municipality, except as otherwise provided for in the Constitution, shall directly or indirectly lend or pledge its credit or make any donation to or in aid of any person, association, or public or private corporation. The law makes it clear that there are limitations on how public funds and assets can be used. The uses provided for in the Constitution are the care and maintenance of sick and indigent persons, establishing a veteran scholarship program, a loan program for students of the healing arts, providing land, buildings, or facility infrastructures to support new or expanding businesses, and providing for affordable housing. The Constitution makes no distinction as between donations, whether they be for a good cause or a questionable one. It prohibits them all, as was stated in this court case. Only donations made for public purposes are permissible, such as expenditures for public purpose on public property. The sick and indigent exception does not permit the state or local government to make donations to private or nonprofit organizations that are used for organizations' operating expenses. Some of the examples given by the Attorney General. The New Mexico Supreme Court held that it was unconstitutional legislation that authorized counties and municipalities provide financial aid to a nonprofit corporation formed to promote a statewide celebration. And there was a violation where contributions to an American Legion memorial were allowed. Were not allowed. The city could not contribute $500. This section of the city charter mirrors what the New Mexico Constitution states. Well, moving right along into our ethical considerations. We're going to talk about conflict of interest. As you know, you just passed your rules of procedure, and there's an extensive definition, a newer definition in your rules of procedure. So I will invite you to review that, and if you ever have any questions, please let me know. As stated in our ordinance, a conflict of interest exists when a person is involved in multiple interests, financial or otherwise, and serving one interest could involve working against the other. A conflict of interest may exist when a personal interest or organizational interest might adversely affect a duty to make decisions in the best interest of the third party. A public official shall treat their government position as a public trust. The public official shall use the powers and resources of public office only to advance the public interest and not to obtain personal benefits or pursue private interests. Public officials shall conduct themselves in a manner that justifies the confidence placed in them by the people and maintain the integrity and ethically discharge the high responsibilities of public service. Full disclosure of real or potential conflicts of interest shall be a guiding principle for determining appropriate conduct. Reasonable effort shall be made to avoid undue influence and abuse of office in public service. And remember that a conflict of interest can always be waived. So the important thing is, if you believe you have a conflict of interest, is to raise it, because it may be that the rest of the city council does not believe that you have a conflict of interest. And even if there seems to be a minimal impact, the city council can determine as a whole to waive that conflict. So the important thing is to just state the conflict publicly. We will now talk about ex-parte communications. An ex-parte communication means a direct or indirect communication with a party or their representative outside the presence of the other parties about a pending matter that deal with substantive matters or issues on the merits of the proceedings. This includes attachments to a written communication or documents shown in connection with the presentation that deals with matters or issues on the merits of the proceedings. This does not include communications regarding the status of a pending matter or providing administrative information. One of the things that you will that you will see is that oftentimes you will receive an email from a citizen that potentially has something pending before City Council. Or more likely, you might receive something from a citizen that has something pending before the Planning and Zoning Board. That's something that's a little more common. Just remember that that communication could be considered ex parte because the appeal from any planning and zoning decision or administrative decision is to City Council. So just be very mindful of that potential. That's probably the one that we see the most. The City of Las Cruces does have an ethics ordinance. This is located in section 2-2. The purpose is to adopt an objective and enforceable standard of public behavior. It applies to the governing body, city manager, members of boards and commissions, committees, and policy advisory bodies. It establishes a due process procedure for investigating ethics complaints. Upon declaration of candidacy, election, or appointment, each public official must provide information, including professional occupation or business licenses, membership on other city boards, committees, commissions, boards of directors of public or private corporations, and associations or organizations. The nature of the public official's financial interest in a business as defined in the definition section of this article. The ordinance prohibits retaliation against a public official who filed a complaint regarding an ethics violation. There are other prohibitions. Those include private benefits or gifts, personal representation, disclosure of confidential information, use of city services, abuse of position, and interference with or by administration. The investigation for an ethics complaint begins with a complaint filed with the city clerk. It is referred to our external review counsel. If the complaint is without merit, it will be dismissed. Otherwise, the respondent will be informed of the complaint. Formal proceedings shall be initiated by filing a specification of charges with the Ethics Enforcement Board. The respondent will have an opportunity to answer specification of charges, and there will be a hearing within 30 days after time to answer the specification of charges. The hearing will be considered adversarial with sworn witnesses, and external review counsel will be the prosecutor. The board chair shall preside, and board members may question witnesses. Within 10 days, parties may submit findings and conclusions, and the board shall submit their own findings and conclusions in 30 to 60 days. Since I have been here, which is close to 5 years, I've never seen this process utilized. There have, I think, been 1 or 2 ethics complaints. However, they were unfounded, either because the facts as they occurred just didn't occur, or because there was no actual violation of the action claimed. So I guess we don't really, I don't think this city council has ever had to have that type of hearing. The consideration by the Ethics Enforcement Board. The appointment of a hearing panel is found in section 2-12. The submission of briefs or requests for oral argument is in 2-12. And the panel will render a decision within the 30 days after oral argument or briefs. That's in section 2-13. The recommendations will be dismissal, public reprimand, or suspension. We do have an accountability and government ordinance. The purpose of that ordinance is to provide increased accountability, integrity, and oversight of the entire consolidated government to assist in promoting economy, efficiency, improve operations, and deter and identify waste, fraud, and abuse. There are ordinance objectives for internal audit and an inspector general. The objectives are to create sufficient independence to assure that no interference or influence will adversely affect investigations. They establish jurisdiction in accordance with best practice models, and they establish professional standards and requirements for those 2 positions. It also creates a standard for reporting. The ordinance does create an oversight committee, which we briefly referenced a few minutes ago. The oversight committee is a management committee, and it is not a public board, commission, or committee. So it is not subject to the Open Meetings Act. The committee is not formed to formulate public policy. The members of the committee are subject to the ethics ordinance. And the committee may provide the auditor and the inspector general with guidance, priorities, and potential areas for investigation. The committee may also provide the city auditor and the inspector general with recommendations for priorities and potential areas for investigation and audits. They may also provide technical advice on technical issues. The Oversight Committee shall not prohibit the Inspector General or the City Auditor from initiating, carrying out, or completing any audit, investigation, or strategic review. If a majority of the committee finds that an audit, investigation, or strategic review is questionable, then the committee may issue a cautionary statement to the IG or the City Auditor. The purpose of this is to safeguard that the investigation has answered all questions and has been conducted thoroughly and completely. The committee cannot change a report, but it can provide additional information or ask needed questions. We did reference earlier the hotline, and as I informed the City Council earlier, there are two hotlines, and I believe that these numbers need to be updated because they have been combined into one. We don't have two separate employee and public, and they also can be accessed online, and I can provide that information to you. It's also located on our city website. Okay, that was a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't think so. The two ladies are extremely intelligent. They got it right, figured it all out, and they're ready to roll, right? Just, yeah, there you go. See, thumbs up. No, I'm just kidding. Any questions for? So earlier, I don't know, I haven't checked, but I know that we got sometimes we get an email from a fellow by the name of Larry, and he sends it to City Council. So basically just don't respond because, in fact, if they're listening, members of the public, I'm starting to see this more and more, and I think I mentioned this the other day. They're just emailing all the city councilors. They don't care where you live. They just say, okay, well, not only do I send it to my regular councilor, I'm sending it to everybody. And then next thing you know, they can't even respond, really. I mean, theoretically you could, but you got to leave them off. Sometimes I do, and of course I'll just copy Mayor Pro Tem, and that's about it, because they send it to all of us. So, yeah, it's a learning curve, and I know there's a lot to go over, but I'm sure you all have access to this information. Keep it in a little notebook. Mayor Pro Tem.
Sorry, Mayor. Yes, thank you, Jennifer, for the presentation. Lots of good information. I wanted to move back to the slide where you speak to ex parte and our quasi-judicial role as things move through P&Z. There might be a time where an actual case gets appealed and then it comes to council. Can you talk a little more specifically about ex parte and maybe an example where that might be the case? And if you don't have one, I think I have one, because someone tried to speak to me in relation to a case that they were very concerned in Councilor Graham's area. And they're like, well, what good is Councilor Graham and you if you can't talk to me about this? And I said, can't talk specific about the case. I understand the case is moving through that P&Z process. So Jennifer, can you kind of speak a little more specifically about that? Because that's where I think we have a tendency to get tripped up.
Yes, Mayor and Council, I'm not familiar with the specific case that you're talking about, but it's not uncommon because you will have something that goes before P&Z and you will have a concerned property owner who's either contesting it or asking for some kind of change. And even if they haven't even if there's a ruling that's not necessarily disfavorable, they will tend to call to talk about what's the next step and what's going to happen with City Council. You can provide them information about the next step is this. What you can't do is talk about the specifics of the case and what they want to happen with the case. That would be considered an ex parte, because you are not affording, what it does is violates due process, because you're not affording the opposing party or the other parties involved the opportunity to hear the information, and then you're receiving only one side of the information without opportunity for rebuttal or argument. So you can provide information about process. If that does occur, I do recommend that you refer people to Larry Nichols' group, and they can provide the information, or to the legal department, and we can provide more information. It just makes it easier so that you don't get involved in a conversation that maybe was not intended to be an ex parte communication, but could turn into one later. And it's mostly, the disadvantage, of course, would be to the opposing party in that action.
Thanks, Jennifer. I did exactly that. And then the last thing is on OMA and the quorum. Could you talk a little more specifically about the process? I know that there's a quorum notice that goes out. We get invited to a lot of meetings, our ribbon cutting events and such, and you all, Christine does a really good job of placing that. But what is that process? And if we had a meeting that we thought possibly more than 3 of us would attend, what is the process for an individual counselor?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and Mayor. The notice for a potential quorum notice is not anything that is required by law. It's a courtesy, but it doesn't have any legal effect. It isn't a proper notice, and it does not comply with OMA standards. It basically puts the City Council on notice that there's going to be a quorum here. Don't talk about city business at this event because you might have a quorum. So if that occurs and you attend an event like that, you can attend. What can't occur is that the City Council members cannot begin to discuss city business because it hasn't been noticed in compliance with the OMA. So just remember that the potential quorum notice is not proper notice. It's more of a courtesy to let everybody know there's going to be more than 3 of you there, potentially. So if that does occur, I haven't heard of that occurring, so because the City Council is very careful about things like that. But if it did occur, I would just leave the event if you can, or certainly notice the person. It could be that one of you isn't aware that there are 3 other people there. So just make sure that everybody is aware of who is there if you are all there. You can talk to each other, you just can't talk about city business.
Before I get to Councilor Quorum,
Thanks, Jennifer.
let me just state, sometimes, and I think it just got canceled, but a lot of times the Martin Luther King breakfast is very well attended. And a lot of times there's more than 3, just make sure you sit not together, just in a different chair setting, and I think you'll be fine. If you can see, if you spot, if the DA is there or assistant DA, just make sure that they know that you're sitting separate, because they're the ones who would then be the ones who prosecute for the OMA. That way, just a little heads up. Mayor Pro Tem, I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you have anything you want to say?
No, Mayor, thank you. Those were all my questions.
Okay. Councilor Conan?
Thank you. I think Mayor Pro Tem was referring to something in my district related to the P&Z, but I just really wanted to take this opportunity to thank you, City Attorney Vega, City Clerk Christine. They have given us an extraordinary orientation over the last about month, in addition to a lot of city departments, and I really do want to give gratitude because you actually interrupted that I think what eventually went to Mayor Pro Tem Gondra, my conversations that happened before I was elected. So your orientations were really, really helpful and gave us great food for thought in advance of this. So thank you. I don't know that we're really so smart that we could pick all this up that quickly, but you guys have been been incredibly kind with your time. And so I just wanted to thank you and the other departments that have really onboarded us well. So thank you so much for shepherding us in this venture. So, and I'm sorry about that, Mayor Pro Tem, that me not responding to something because I panicked, because I didn't want to break a rule, resulted in you getting a call. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. And Councilor, one thing that Mayor Pro Tem had asked for us to update the procurement code. We do provide notebooks with just a bunch of information. I do have the updated procurement code, and I apologize, I should have brought it today, but I'll make sure that each of you have it in your office so that you can add it to your notebook that you already have.
Any other questions? Okay, so I believe that concludes our work session.
I'm sorry, Mayor, it does not. We have to cover IPRA.
Oh, there's more?
Yes, that we're not finished. My part is finished, but we do have to cover IPRA.
Okay, all
The
right.
much loved
Okay.
IPRA.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of City Council. My name is Lisa Herrera. I'm the Records Manager, and I'm going to be discussing the Inspection of Public Records Act and how it relates to us as employees. New Mexico State Statute 14-2-1 is the Inspection of Public Records Act, and this gives any member of the public the right to inspect public records. There are limited exceptions, which I'll go over shortly. It is the public policy of the state that providing people with information is an integral part of the routine duties of public officers and employees. It should be noted that this act does not require a public body to create a public record. It's for requesting existing records. I won't read this whole definition, but this is what the definition of a public record is by New Mexico law. Basically, it's everything that you create through the course of your work as a public employee is a public record. As I mentioned before, there are certain exceptions. I'm just going to run through them rather quickly. Some exceptions would be medical records, letters of reference concerning employment, licensing, or permits, matters of opinion in personnel files or student files, law enforcement records that reveal confidential sources, methods, information, or individuals accused but not charged with a crime, other documents as provided by the Confidential Materials Act. Other exceptions would be trade secrets, attorney-client privileged information, and long-range or strategic business plans of public hospitals discussed in a properly closed meeting, tactical response plans or procedures, protected personal identifier information, that would be like a date of birth, social security number, banking account information, and as otherwise provided by law. The procedure for requesting a public record, an oral or written request must be made to the designated custodian of records. We have a website that citizens can go on and request records, or they can go into the city clerk's office and fill out a form. We also have a designated email address if anybody wants to submit a request through email. A written request shall include the name, address, and telephone number of the person making the request, and the written request shall identify the record that they want to inspect with reasonable particularity. The person making the request does not have to state the reason that they are making the request. It should also be noted that the procedures outlined in the Inspection of Public Records Act only apply to written requests. There is no penalty for failure to respond to an oral request. The city has designated the city clerk as the custodian of records, and the city clerk has designated the records manager to process all incoming public record requests. Part of the records custodian responsibility is if a request is not received by the correct custodian, then the person receiving the correct request shall forward the request to the correct custodian if it's known, and shall notify the requester. The custodian must separate exempt information from non-exempt information, And if a record is exempt from public disclosure, the custodian must inform the requester of the reason for the exemptions. The record must be provided as soon as practicable, but no later than 15 days after receiving the written request. If a request is not made within 3 days, the custodian must explain when the record will be available or when the public body will respond. If the custodian determines that the request is excessively burdensome or broad, they may be allowed additional reasonable time to comply. As I mentioned before, the city provides an electronic method for requesting records found on our city website. The records manager receives all requests, carefully reviews each request, and forwards the request to the city department or employee that holds that record. The city department provides that record to the records manager, and the records manager then reviews those records to see if anything needs to be redacted or if any of those documents need to be reviewed by the legal department to determine privilege or confidentiality. Just some quick stats of our IPRA numbers. As you can see, they've been steadily increasing over the years. There was quite a jump from 2020 to 2021. We got 1,085 requests in 2020, and calendar year 2021, we got a total of 1,501 requests for public information. That's all I have. I'll open it to questions if you have any.
Thank you, Lisa. Any questions? No? Okay.
Thank you.
I just want to point out that, and they can concur with this, I believe it's been found that, a lot of times people try to get me to do city business on my Facebook, which I don't. I just say, listen, you got to email me, and then I'll respond. Because if you start doing that on your personal stuff, I believe they can then bring that into the fold, and then all that gets part of it. So I would just my suggestion would be just say, hey, you know what, just email me. And so, was there another part to this? That's it? Oh, that didn't take that long.
Thank you, that's it, thank you.
Oh, okay. All right, so if there's nothing further, then I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Motion made by Councilor Bencomo, second by Mayor Pro Tem. Okay, that we adjourn. Christine?
This is on the motion to adjourn the work session. Councilor Abeyta-Stuvey is absent. Councilor Graham?
Yes.
Councilor Bencomo?
Yes.
Councilor Coran?
Yes.
Councilor Flores is absent. Councilor Gandara?
Yes.
And Mayor.
Yes. Okay, we're adjourned, and what time is it? 3:11 p.m. All right. Thank you. Okay, so this is the agenda setting meeting for our January 18th, 2022 City Council meeting. Number 1, non-consent.
1 non-consent.
2, non-consent.
2 non-consent.
3, non-consent.
3 non-consent.
4, consent.
4 consent.
5, non-consent.
5 non-consent.
6, non-consent.
6 non-consent.
7, non-consent.
7 non-consent.
8, consent.
8 consent.
9, non-consent.
9 non-consent.
10, non-consent.
10 non-consent.
11, non-consent.
11 non-consent.
12, non-consent.
12 non-consent.
13, non-consent.
13 non-consent.
14, non-consent.
14 non-consent.
15, non-consent.
15 non-consent.
16, non-consent.
16 non-consent.
17, non-consent.
17 non-consent.
18, non-consent.
18 non-consent.
19, non-consent.
19 non-consent.
20, non-consent.
20 non-consent.
21, non-consent.
21 non-consent.
22, non-consent.
22 non-consent.
23, non-consent.
23 non-consent.
24, non-consent.
24 non-consent.
25, consent.
25 consent.